the 10 things that I'm grateful for during a pandemic. I won't give you the whole spiel, but just a little skeleton. Number one, I'm grateful for technology like this that links us together even when we can't be together. I'm reminded that during the 1919 flu epidemic, when people were isolated, they were really isolated in a way that we're not. So I'm grateful for that. Number two, I'm incredibly grateful for healthcare workers who are putting their lives at risk. And one of those is my nephew, Robert, who is an RN in Dallas, who was recently hospitalized with COVID. And by the grace of God, he's fine now. Third, I'm really grateful for scientists like John Emerson and all the rest who are discovering the cure for this pandemic. And I'm so grateful that the scientists have come across something that looks great. Four, I'm really grateful for essential workers, people who oftentimes are minorities who have to work. I'm grateful for the person who throws my newspaper every morning, and so many other people at the grocery store, etc. Number five, I'm really grateful for all the helping agencies, including the churches and the governments and the nonprofits, who are actually feeding so many people during this pandemic because of the economic crisis and all the other helping agencies that have banded together. Number six, I'm really grateful for folks who are pressing for racial and social justice, even in the midst of a pandemic, largely inspired, I suppose, by George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others. I'm grateful for them. I'm grateful, number seven, for all the election workers who got out there and exposed themselves in the middle of a pandemic to make our democratic process work. And this year, of course, there were a lot of older folks working as election workers, but think of all the young people who stepped up this year. Number eight, I'm really grateful for the fact that teachers and parents and students can continue their education, even as difficult as it has been. But I'm so grateful for all those that made that possible. Number nine, I'm really grateful for family and friends. And I could go on and on about how grateful I am for them. And fourth, and tenth, I'm grateful for faith that binds us together in communities of hope, where we can really hope and pray for the end of this pandemic, for a peaceful transfer of power, for people getting their jobs back and their health back. So there's a lot of stuff I'm grateful for. And it was a nice exercise that Najib Arhan kind of asked me to do. So I put that out there for you to be grateful. So let's open with prayer. God, we are grateful to be gathered together, even from sea to shining sea, that we might listen and learn from your word through Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, good morning, everybody. It is so nice to see your virtual faces. So today, and thank you, Matthew, as always, for hosting this. I really appreciate it. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the early church and what the early church faced when she began her proclamation of the good news of Jesus. And the early church leaders met three different kinds of authorities that they had to contend with. One was Rome, but Rome, as you will see in Acts 1 through 12, sort of disappears until the 10th chapter. More on that later. Then the big opponent turns out to be the Sanhedrin. And we'll see that the Sanhedrin itself is divided, and we'll get to that in a moment. But then one of the most pernicious opponents in this Acts 1 through 12 is King Herod Agrippa I, and we'll get to him in a moment. So after the death of Jesus, one of the big surprises is that the Roman authorities did not go after Jesus' disciples as though they were zealots. If they really thought that Jesus was a zealot, they would have arrested and probably executed all the apostles. And it just shows you that this was a trumped up charge, and Rome knew it. So Rome sort of dismisses them as cranks or whatever, but they don't arrest them. And I'm not sure that I've actually ever thought about that before preparing this class, that Rome knew that Jesus was harmless, perhaps a lunatic, and therefore his disciples should not be arrested. The real opponents as we'll see, turn out to be the Sanhedrin and King Herod Agrippa, that puppet ruler. So let's think about what Acts 1 through 12 is all about. It describes the birth of the church because of the resurrection of Jesus. These are the resurrection people who've been inspired by Christ to make the world different. So they form themselves
I'm
into
getting no audio from Frank. Is it everyone else having the same problem?
Matthew, are we having audio problems?
I haven't had any audio problem. I think that's on your end, John.
Sorry, John. So what you must think about is that these resurrection people form an alternative community. It's a different kind of community than Rome would establish with its Pax Romana, and it's a different kind of community than the Sanhedrin would establish with its sort of Jewish rules and all the rest. This is a new kind of people, the new people of God. And what does this alternative community look like? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are three things that distinguish this resurrection people. Number one, they are inspired by the risen Christ to bear witness to the world. Number two, they have a kind of radical sharing among themselves in this new community that is astonishing. And three, they're incredibly inclusive of this sort of cross-cultural community, trying to bring people together that would typically never, ever congregate in the world. So they are an inspired group of witnesses. They are sharing in a radical kind of way, and they are forming a community of a very diverse population. So let's think first about this community that's inspired by the risen Christ to bear witness to the world. In Acts 1, you have the picture of Jesus' ascension, and as Jesus is ascending, he says to his disciples, listen, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. That's the theme song of the book of Acts, Acts 1:8. And the whole book is set up on a sort of set of concentric circles that get wider and wider. Starts in Jerusalem, goes to all of Judea, then it goes to Samaria, and then it goes to the uttermost ends of the world, which in the book of Acts ends up being what? Rome. So this book starts in Jerusalem and it ends in Rome. And they're going to be worldwide witnesses to what they have experienced. And part of their witness will be their preaching. And there will be many, many sermons, and we'll come back to some of those in just a moment. But the main sermon is in Acts 10, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There also, the word witness in Greek, martyria, means both verbal proclamation, but it also means to witness with your life. So in Acts 1 through 12, we have two different martyrdoms. The first is in chapter 7, is Stephen, who at the end of a long sermon accuses his Jewish opponents of being stiff-necked people, and so they get the rocks and they stone him. And so Stephen is the first of the martyrs of the Christian church. Chapter 12 is a different story, and I want to switch to talking with you about Herod Agrippa I, because he's the one who's involved in the execution of James, the brother of John, one of the apostles. I did some research this week on Herod Agrippa I, and he's a fascinating character. He's the grandson of Herod the Great. And at the age of 6, which was 4 BC, he was taken to Rome. And so his childhood is spent in the court of the emperor, Augustus Caesar. And in his 20s, he's sent to Palestine, but he has a financial disaster happen to, and he contemplates committing suicide. But then his relative, Herod Antipas, remember Herod Antipas, appoints him to an administrative commission, but later they fire him because he's so corrupt. And then he moves back to Rome, and he has a friendship with this guy at the Roman court named Caligula, and he becomes a pal with Caligula. And in fact, he says, Caligula, you're going to be emperor someday. And that does not sit well with the sitting emperor, who is Tiberius Caesar. And Tiberius Caesar throws him in jail and probably would have had him executed. But fortunately for Herod Agrippa I, Tiberius dies, and Caligula does in fact become the emperor. And what does he do? Caligula sends him back to Israel, and he becomes the ruler of basically Galilee. And there in Galilee, he has some difficulties with Herod Antipas, who's ruling various parts of Israel. And finally, Agrippa is sent to Rome, and he's there, guess what, when Caligula is murdered. And he helps the new emperor, Claudius, to become set up as emperor. And so in gratitude, Claudius sends him back to Israel and makes him king, and he becomes basically the king of the same area that King Herod the Great was over, meaning all the way from Jerusalem up to Galilee, etc. So he rules as king of Israel from 41 to 44, and he dies at age 54. Now, I just have to do this. Acts 12 depicts the death of Herod Agrippa. Now remember, Herod Agrippa had executed James, the brother of John, and this is what Acts 12:20 says, how Herod Agrippa met his demise. Herod was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, so they sent in a group to see him. First, they convinced Blastus, the man in charge of the palace, that he should help them. Then they went to Herod Agrippa I and asked him for peace, because their country got its food supplies from the king's country. So on a chosen day, Herod put on his royal robe, sat on his throne, and made a speech to the people. It isn't a man speaking, but a God, they shout. At once, the angel of the Lord struck Herod down because he did not give honor to God. He was eaten by worms and died. Okay, so that's how Herod Agrippa ends up after executing James. He gets eaten by worms. So there. So there's witness first by means of their speaking, their preaching, as well as with their life. Stephen and James. And then there's witness by means of these miracles. And so much of Acts 1 through 12 has this sort of miraculous character to it. And there's two kinds of miracles going on in Acts 1 through 12. There's miracles of healing, and there's miracles of deliverance. The miracles of healing are all over the book. In 3, Peter will heal a crippled beggar in the temple. In 5, Peter's shadow will heal people. Now that's pretty amazing. Philip will, in chapter 8, will do exorcisms and all kinds of healings in Samaria. In 9, a man named Ananias, who's been paralyzed for 18 years, he's healed. And then, of course, in chapter 9 is the centerpiece of the miraculous in Acts 1 through 12. It is the raising of Dorcas from the dead in Joppa. So these are remarkable healings, but maybe just as remarkable are all the miracles of deliverance. My goodness, in chapter 4, Peter and John are threatened by the Sanhedrin, but then they're released. In chapter 5, all the apostles are jailed, but an angel releases them, but then they're brought back to the Sanhedrin to explain, now, what are you doing? And in chapter 5, verse 29 is the most important text regarding the relationship between the early Christian community and the authorities. And here's the phrase that you should remember, is in 5:29, where Peter says to the Sanhedrin when they wanted to shut him up, he said, we must obey God rather than human authorities. Now, if you study the history of Christian civil disobedience from the first century to Martin Luther King and beyond, the truth is that verse is sort of the marching orders for all forms of Christian civil disobedience. We must obey God rather than human authority. And it's interesting now that Gamaliel, who is a Pharisee and a member of the Sanhedrin, basically mentions that, look, if God is with them, they will succeed. If God is against them, then they will fail, like some other revolutionary leaders that he references, Theudas and Judas and some others who the Romans put down. And so at the end of that encounter, the apostles are whipped and then they're released. But that's not all. In chapter 9, Paul is converted. We'll come back to him in a moment. And he's lowered down in a basket from the wall of Damascus. And then later in Jerusalem, he's warned in a dream that he's going to die. So he gets out of town and goes to Tarsus. Chapter 12, I've already told you about this Herod who will end up killing James. But in the same chapter, Peter is also imprisoned, and they're about to probably kill Peter the way that he had killed James. But Peter again has this angel who shows up in jail, and he gets out of jail, and he's freed, and they can't find Peter. So going back, what you have in this new community is a community that's inspired by the Spirit to bear witness to the risen Christ. And there are many sermons. They also bear witness with their life and martyrdom. And then there's these witness of these miracles where people are healed and they're delivered from their incredible danger. Now, the second aspect of this resurrection community is a radical kind of sharing. It reminds me a little bit of what Israel went through in the wilderness. In the wilderness, they had sort of communal living at its best. That is to say, each day they're fed with manna. They have water brought to them in the desert. They're living a sort of communal sharing in a radical sense. Well, what happens in Acts is that this new community tries to replicate in an urban setting this radical sharing, so that at the end of Acts 2, it says that people would sell their goods and hold all things in common. That's reiterated in chapter 4, where it says Barnabas sold his field and they distributed among the needy. So you had this new community that was sharing in a radical kind of sharing. Some would call it a sort of early Christian communitarianism or communism, whatever you want to call it. But here's what happens to that radical sharing. Chapter 5 pours a little cold water over this radical sharing, and it's called Ananias and Sapphira, who claim to have sold land like Barnabas and bring it to the feet of the apostles, but they lie. They didn't bring all their money. And so, as one famous evangelist said, Ananias and Sapphira lie and then they die. So there's this awe that goes over the community. And you would think that that would break up the radical sharing. But in chapter 6, that radical sharing continues, but this time it's administered by the deacons. And two of the most famous of those deacons are Philip and Stephen. And so they start sharing with the people through the deacons. Now, just a quick note on this, 2 points. One is, we don't have evidence of that kind of radical sharing happening in any other early Christian community outside of Jerusalem. I often have wondered if the reason it didn't go over so well in other places is the story of Ananias and Sapphira, because they're kind of a warning tale of what happens when it's not conducted truthfully. I'm studying right now a whole lot of books on utopian theories in America. And it's interesting that every utopian community, including, by the way, the one Marx and Lenin proposed, will always reference Acts 2 and 4 as kind of what people should do, that is, to share their resources in a radical kind of way. But the point is, the Ananias and Sapphira story shows that there's always some internal tension within keeping my stuff from you, mine and yours. And so it's interesting that almost every utopian, communitarian, communist Christian community has almost always fallen apart for exactly the same reasons as Ananias and Sapphira. There's that inability to truly share and to lie about it. So, first of all, this alternative community is a community of witness. Secondly, a community of radical sharing. And third, and maybe most important, is they're a radically inclusive and cross-cultural community. At the beginning of Acts, chapter 2, it lists all these Jews where they're from. They're from all over the Mediterranean world. They've come there to Pentecost, and they had this experience of seeing the Spirit poured out on the apostles. So at the very beginning of Acts, you get this sense that all these pilgrims who've come to Jerusalem, they're going to be going back to their communities all across the Mediterranean world, and they will report this astonishing thing that they've seen at Pentecost. So it starts like that. Then in chapter 8, you remember Acts 1 through 8 said, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. Well, chapter 8, you have Philip, one of the deacons, going up to Samaria and preaching, and people are astonished. He does some miracles and other things. And so Peter starts the mission to the whole world in Samaria. And then later on in chapter 8, Philip runs across this Ethiopian eunuch who has come to Jerusalem to worship. Maybe he's a Jewish convert. And he's reading from Isaiah 53, and Philip gets up in the carriage and rides along with him and interprets for him what that passage means, meaning the suffering servant is Christ. And the Ethiopian eunuch is baptized, and he's on his way back to Ethiopia. So here we go. Jews from all over the world, now they're going back to tell what happened. Then you have Samaria. Then you have an Ethiopian who's going out to Africa. And then in chapter 10 is where we'll kind of end our morning today. But in chapter 10, you get the story of Peter goes to Joppa, and he is resting during the middle of the day after dinner. It's hot, and he has a dream. And the dream goes like this. A sheet comes down from heaven, and there's all kinds of animals in it, and they're clean and unclean, kosher and non-kosher. And in this dream, Peter is told to kill and eat a non-kosher animal. And Peter resists, saying, look, I've been a kosher-driven Jew all my life. I would never do something like that. And in fact, the dream now is going to be interpreted by what happens after he awakes. There's a knock on the door, and it's some servants of this Roman centurion who lives up in Caesarea, just north of where Joppa is. And he sends down some visitors to say, look, our commander, Cornelius, had a dream. And he was told to send for someone named Simon Peter in Joppa. And we're here to ask you to come and talk to our master, the centurion Cornelius. So you have both a dream for Peter and a dream for Cornelius, and this brings the two together. And Peter goes up to Caesarea. And by the way, do you remember in Luke 7 that there was a Roman centurion that Jesus healed his servant? Well, here you go again. You have another Roman centurion, and he is brought face to face with Peter. And Peter says, what is it you want? And Cornelius says, I was told by an angel to bring you to me to hear what you have to say. And so Peter then does the most famous sermon in Acts. It's Acts 10, 34 through 43, where he rehearses the good news of Jesus Christ. And then the Spirit falls upon these Gentiles. They're all Roman soldiers and etc. And they receive the Spirit, and they are baptized. And so now this is called the Gentile Pentecost. But notice how important this is. This is a way of breaking out of a sort of a Jewish world or even a Samaritan world. And now it's saying the gospel is going to go to our Roman friends, our Gentile friends. And so Peter then leaves and goes back to Jerusalem and explains to the apostles what happened. And I just want to read you one verse in 11:17 where he explains what happens. It is clear that God gave these Gentiles the same gift that he gave us when we believed in the Lord Jesus Christ. Who was I then to try to stop God? So in 11 now, Peter has crossed over the divide between Jew and Gentile, and they have been included in this new resurrection people. It is the most important step in all of Acts because it moves the church out of being a sort of a Jewish sect into a worldwide community that overcomes the distinctions between Jew and Gentile, between poor and rich, between folks that are would never have anything to do with each other. Now they're brought together. And so Acts sort of ends in chapter 11 with the disciples going up to Antioch, which is in present day Lebanon. And now that will become the launching pad for Paul in his missionary journeys throughout the rest of the Mediterranean world. So to recap what we've talked about this morning, remember that this is a community that's a new kind of community, and they're a community of witness, and they bear witness with their words, their lives, with these miracles of healing and of deliverance. And then this community will share radically with each other the resources that they have received from God. And thirdly, it becomes an inclusive community that will include what? Jews, Samaritans, Gentiles. And that becomes the sort of new face of humanity that Acts will propose. Now, what we're going to do next week, starting in chapter 13, is see where Paul takes the church from Antioch to points west. And we'll get that more next week. So that's kind of what we're talking about here. I would say in terms of our theme of bearing witness to authorities, Acts 1 through 12 shows us what happens when the early Jewish Christian community faces up against the Sanhedrin. We must obey God rather than human authority. And then when it faces up against Herod Agrippa I, they bear witness with their lives to him. So that's a little bit about Acts 1 through 12. Let me stop and see if you have some comments. And I want to especially remind you that in terms of Christian relationships with political authorities, by far in this section, the most important verse is in 5:29, when Peter says, we have to obey God rather than human authorities. Now, they're not going to become zealots and try to overcome the authorities, but they're going to bear witness, and they're going to pay for that witness by being thrown in jail and martyrdom, etc. All right. So